Have you ever heard of a battle that wasn't really decided by bullets or bravery, but something way more basic? Fuel? Because that's what happened to Jochen Piper and his men in Belgium, December 1944. It pretty much sums up how the war was lost before some people even realised it. It's always been a story that's just been fascinating to me because it's not just about tanks and fighting, it's about math, logistics, and how one side had oceans of fuel while the other was running on fumes, quite literally. So picture this, it's December 17th, 1944, it's freezing cold, early morning, 5:30 am-ish, near this small Belgian village called Honsfeld. The German Tiger tanks are lined up, ready to roll, but instead of roaring to life, one of them coughs, sputters, and dies. Inside, the driver tries to restart it, but nothing. The gauge is empty. And not just that, the tank's reserve tank was empty too. That's when their commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Piper, climbs out of his tank, boots crunching in the frozen dirt, and realizes what's going on. His entire armoured column, one of the most elite units Germany had, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and 5,000 Waffen-SS troops, is dead in the water because they've got no fuel. Not even a drop. Imagine that, you're leading the spearhead of Hitler's last big gamble, the Ardennes offensive, the so-called Battle of the Bulge, and you can't even move because your tanks are dry. And right in front of them is the American position, abandoned in a hurry, fires still burning in oil drums, hot coffee left behind, and then they see it. Rows upon rows of jerry cans, those familiar olive green American fuel containers. Thousands of them. It must have felt like stumbling onto buried treasure. So Piper's men can't believe it. They pry one open, take a whiff, and it's gasoline. High-octane American gasoline. They start frantically refueling their tanks, pouring this miracle lifeblood into the German machines that have been running on fumes for days. Piper starts counting. 50,000 gallons. Enough to keep his entire battle group moving towards the Meuse River. Enough to potentially change the whole course of the offensive. But while he's watching all this happen, a thought hits him, and it's not a comforting one. He realizes that if the Americans can just walk away from that much fuel, leaving it behind like it's nothing, then Germany is finished. Because that means the Allies have so much supply, they can afford to abandon what Germany would literally fight to the death for. And that's exactly what happened. Just 6 months earlier, Hitler's own armaments minister, Albert Speer, had warned him that Germany's synthetic fuel production, the stuff keeping this war machine alive, was collapsing. Allied bombers had absolutely shattered his factories. The big hydrogenation plants at places like Blackhammer and Brooks were producing less than 10% of what they once did. The numbers were catastrophic, really. The US in 1944 produced about 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, even counting its synthetic fuel and whatever it got from Romania, managed about 33 million. That's less than 2% of the American production. So yeah, they were trying to fight a mechanized war with what was basically horse-drawn logistics. It's no exaggeration. The Wehrmacht was using horse carts to move supplies while the Americans were trucking in the rivers of gasoline. And here's the wild part. Hitler knew all of this and still launched the Ardennes offensive. His generals had told him it would take about 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp, the key objective. He allocated 5 million gallons, but barely half of that even arrived at the front line due to transportation issues. They were gambling everything on capturing American fuel dumps along the way. If that doesn't scream desperation, I really don't know what does. And meanwhile, the Americans had built this insanely effective supply system across Europe. They called it the Red Ball Express, a non-stop convoy system that delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. On top of that, they had a network of pipelines, including one literally running the English Channel called Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. By December 44, the US Army in Europe was burning through about 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and still had a surplus coming in. They were getting more than they could even use. The Germans couldn't even imagine that level of abundance. Now, Piper was no rookie. He was just 29 years old, but already a decorated veteran on the Eastern Front. He'd seen the hell of mechanized warfare up close. He knew that without fuel, tanks are just expensive bunkers. And when his battle group was chosen to lead the main assaults in the Ardennes, he was given 31,000 gallons of fuel. That sounds like a lot until you realize it was only enough to get his tanks about 50 miles, and the river they needed to reach was 65 miles away. From the beginning, the maths just didn't add up. So he ordered his troops to conserve every drop. Tanks moved in single file, engines were shut off during any stop longer than 5 minutes, and above all, capturing American fuel was priority number one. Tactical objectives came second to this, and yet across the lines, American tank units were practically swimming in gasoline. One US captain wrote in his diary around the same time, "Received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks already full." Imagine reading that if you're a German. You'd probably cry. Anyway, the offensive kicks off at dawn, December 16th. The Germans unleashed this massive artillery barrage, the biggest they'd fired in months. For a moment, it looks like the old Blitzkrieg magic is back, but it's all an illusion. The tanks roll out and immediately hit problems. Roads that look like highways on maps turn out to be narrow, muddy forest tracks. The whole armoured column gets jammed up for miles, and when they finally meet resistance, it's not from a big American division. It's from just 18 guys, an intelligence platoon, who hold them off for nearly 10 hours. 10 hours! I mean, meanwhile, the German tanks are sitting there idling, wasting their precious fuel, and by the time they reach Honsfeld the next morning, they've only advanced about 20 miles and already burned through nearly half their fuel. Half. And then they find that American depot, and for a brief moment it looks like their luck changed. That fuel dump wasn't even a major one. It was just a small forward supply point, yet it made more gasoline than an entire German panzer division would get in a month. One of Piper's men later said it looked like pyramids of jerry cans, 3 meters high, stretching for hundreds of meters. The Americans hadn't even tried to blow it up. The Germans couldn't believe their luck. And yet, discovery was more devastating psychologically than anything else, because as they examined the paperwork, they realized how that gasoline had gotten there. It had come from Texas, literally across the ocean, shipped to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, over the Channel to Normandy, and then trucked hundreds of miles inland into Belgium, all in less than 6 weeks. Just think about that, logistically. The Germans couldn't move a few thousand gallons from one city to another without it being bombed. The Americans were moving millions across the ocean like it was nothing. Some of Piper's men even found copies of the Stars and Stripes newspapers lying around. The front page headline talked about a new pipeline delivering 300,000 gallons of fuel per day from the French coast to the front lines. 300,000 gallons a day through a pipe. That single pipeline moved more fuel every day than Piper's entire division would use in the whole operation. It must have hit them hard. You can imagine their shock. These guys had been told for years that Germany's engineering and discipline could overcome everything and anything. And here they were, realizing they were fighting an enemy that could afford to drown its tanks in gasoline and still have more waiting behind it. By this point in the war, the German situation was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe barely had enough aviation fuel to keep its planes in the air. Pilot training had been cut dramatically, down to maybe 60 total hours. The Navy's ships were stuck in port. Civilians hadn't seen cars on the road in years. Gasoline was so precious, people were getting arrested for stealing single liters of it. Farmers were back to using horses. Meanwhile, Americans were producing 2/3 of the world's oil. Just the East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of occupied Europe combined. The Germans just hadn't accepted it yet. But for now, Piper and his men used the fuel they'd captured and pushed forward. They made it to another town, Bullingen, and found even more supplies, food, ammunition, and of course more fuel. They even found maps showing where other depots were located, but what those maps really showed was that the Americans had fuel everywhere. Every crossroad, every village, it was like an endless network of supply. The US First Army alone had over 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Still, Piper kept going, and just down the road at a place called Stavelot, there was another massive depot. 2 million gallons this time. That was enough to reach the Meuse and maybe even push beyond. But when his tanks arrived, the Americans were already setting it on fire. Literally, Captain John Brewster, an American engineer, had been told to deny the fuel to the enemy at all costs. So he and his men poured gasoline trails between the stacks and tossed phosphorus grenades into them. The whole place went up like a volcano, a wall of fire hundreds of feet high, burning for 3 days straight. Piper's tanks rolled up just in time to see 2 million gallons of gasoline turning into a black pillar of smoke. And he just stood there, watching, saying nothing for a while, and then he reportedly told his driver, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to deny it to us. What are we doing here?" That's the moment he understood. You can't win against an enemy who can casually destroy what you desperately need just to spite you. Across Belgium that week, American engineers torched fuel depots left and right. 8 million gallons gone in a matter of days. That's more fuel than the Germans had allocated for the entire offensive. And yet, for the Americans, it was just a logistical note, a minor inconvenience, and that really was the turning point. Not just for Piper, but for the war itself. It wasn't courage or tactics that decided the outcome, it was sheer overwhelming production power. America could outsupply, outfuel, and outlast anything Germany threw at them. The Germans were counting jerry cans, the Americans were counting in the millions. So, after Stavelot, things went downhill fast for Piper and his men. They tried to keep pushing, but every step forward highlighted just how impossible their situation was. By December 18th, they were burning through fuel faster than they could capture it. Tiger tanks weren't exactly fuel efficient. They consumed about 2.5 gallons per mile in combat, Panthers about 1.5, and that's before you factor in Ardennes terrain, which added roughly 40% more consumption. Every firefight, every engine idling while waiting for orders, every rough kilometer of road was eating up what little they had left. And by noon that day, Piper's men had burned through 67,000 gallons since the start of the offensive. But they'd only captured maybe 55,000 gallons. They were running in a deficit, and it was only going to get worse. Meanwhile, Americans knew exactly what was happening. Ultra intercepts, signals intelligence, let them monitor German radio traffic, so General Courtney Hodges could make a simple calculated decision. The enemy is critically short on fuel. His orders were clear: destroy any fuel that might be captured, and that's exactly what they did. While Piper's men were starving for gasoline, American C-47 transport planes were flying were flying sorties non-stop, delivering hundreds of thousands of gallons to Bastogne alone. The amount of fuel the Americans could just casually throw around would have kept Piper's entire battle group running for months. And by December 19th, Piper's unit were literally abandoning tanks mid-advance. Not because of battle damage, not because of tactical mistakes, but because they ran out of gas. They tried to consolidate the remaining fuel, maybe 8,000 gallons, but that was barely enough for one engagement, let alone a retreat or pursuit. Every step forward was a gamble, every maneuver a mathematical problem with no solution. And on December 20th, a radio message confirmed the worst. A fuel convoy intended to resupply them had been destroyed by an Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Piper called his commanders together and laid it out bluntly. We have fuel for maybe 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30. There was no victory here. Führer Hans Gruller later testified that Piper's words hit hard. Gentlemen, we have discovered we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we receive for this entire operation. The realization spread quickly. The Ardennes offensive wasn't just failing, it had been doomed from the start. By December 21st, Piper's troops were effectively surrounded at a place called Lerno. His tanks were immobilized. The Americans around him, the 31st Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, and 3rd Armored, had combined fuel reserves in the hundreds of thousands of gallons for that single day. Piper had barely 1,000. The contrast wasn't just numbers, it was reality. One side could move freely, launch offensives, supply and resupply. The other couldn't even retreat properly without leaving equipment behind. Private First Class Richard McKinney even joked in a letter home that we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks. And it wasn't far from the truth. So December 23rd brought clear weather and another demonstration of American fuel power. Allied aircrafts flew over 2,000 sorties, each burning hundreds of gallons per hour. The Germans would have been grounded for weeks with that fuel demand. But the Americans just kept going, dropping bombs, delivering supplies, keeping the advance moving. By the night of December 3rd into the 24th, Piper made the impossible choice. Abandon all remaining vehicles and escape on foot. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had started the offensive, 39 remained, but they were immobilized. Piper personally oversaw the destruction of his combat tank, along with hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks of equipment, and out of 5,000 men, only 770 made it back. They'd advanced about 60 miles, captured a few depots, and seen firsthand the scale of American logistical power, but at a catastrophic human cost. The news of what Piper had discovered spread quickly through German ranks. Field Marshal Walter Model, when shown the quantities of captured and destroyed fuel, reportedly said, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler refused to accept the reality, dismissing photographs of burning depots as propaganda, but lower ranks, the men on the ground, understood immediately. One of Piper's men, Wilhelm Hoffmann, wrote home, "Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly." That was the scale. This wasn't just about tanks or manpower. By 1944, the Americans produced half of the world's manufactured goods, including aircrafts, ships, tanks. They could roll them out almost endlessly. Germany's limited production could never catch up. They could throw well-trained, experienced soldiers at the Allies, but it didn't matter. The Americans had so much more supply, they could burn millions of gallons just to deny it to their enemy. The psychological effect was also immense. German soldiers were told they were the superior race, trained to believe in efficiency and discipline. When they saw Americans casually discarding supplies, using fuel as if it was water, one POW said decades later, "We knew your production numbers in theory, but seeing soldiers waste more fuel than we possessed made them real." That kind of revelation crushes morale. Faster than a tank shell ever could. By December 24th, Piper had abandoned all remaining vehicles. Tiger tanks, Panthers, half-tracks, all sitting idle, empty of fuel. Meanwhile, Americans continued their advance, constrained only by minor traffic jams caused by vehicle abundance. Third Army alone had around 15,000 vehicles moving forward at once. What Piper learned that December morning in Honsfeld, when they saw their first fuel depot, was the ultimate lesson in industrial warfare. Abundance beats skill. Numbers matter more than courage, logistics more than tactics. One side measured every gallon, rationed every drop, the other measured in millions, poured fuel into tanks, pipelines, and trucks without a second thought. Piper's captured 50 million gallons? A rounding error in the Allied supply system. The legacy of that failure is still visible today. Piper's Tiger tank sits in a Belgian museum in Leno, abandoned with its fuel gauge frozen at empty. Visitors often ask why such a powerful machine with experienced crew wasn't used, and the answer is really simple. There was no fuel. Every detail of the Ardennes offense, from abandoned tanks to burned depots, tells the same story. Germany lost not because their soldiers weren't brave, but because their industry couldn't compete. And it wasn't just Piper's battle group. Across the front, the pattern repeated. Tanks abandoned, ambulances left idle, soldiers marching through the snow without heating, hospitals unable to operate generators. The Germans learned the hard way that in industrial warfare, logistics decides victory. The Allies could literally destroy more fuel than Germany could produce, while still advancing and supplying their troops. It was a lesson that no amount of training or tactical genius could ever overcome. And by the end of December, the Ardennes offensive had failed. Piper and his men, exhausted and demoralized, became part of the grim statistics. Thousands of men lost, hundreds of tanks immobilized or destroyed, but most importantly, the realization that the war was already lost. American production, American pipeline, American trucks, they weren't just tools. They were the real weapons. The story of Honsfeld, Stravelot, and Ardennes in December 1904 isn't just military history, it's industrial history. It's proof that the scale of production, not the heroism of individual soldiers, can decide wars. Piper's empty fuel gauge, preserved in that museum, is a monument to that lesson. One side fought by the litre and the other by the millions. And in the end, the numbers never lie.